Many people all over the world claim to be Scots. Their claims are based on residence, birthright, ancestral history or genetic inheritance. The problem is that Scotland's neither homogeneous, genetically singular or static, and I'm making a series of 5 videos to dip our toes into the water swum by these peoples who made Scotland. And today we start with the rocky outcrop that guards the Clyde at Dumbarton, Dun na Bhreatain, the fort of the Britons. If you're interested in the people, places and events in Scottish history, then click the subscribe button at the bottom right hand side of the screen. In the meantime, let me tell you a story. Now, if you visit Dumbarton Castle today, you'll see the 18th century buildings and fortifications at the location from which Mary Queen of Scots left for France aged 4. But if I take you back to the 6th, 7th and 8th centuries, it was part of something that to me is even more intriguing. You see, before this fort, on those double peaks, there were hill forts that formed a national capital. This was Al Clut, named after this great river, the Rock of the Clyde. But to tell the story, we need to go back even further. You see, 5 miles east, up the river towards Glasgow, is Old Kilpatrick. It was the most westerly point of the Antonine Wall, the frontier built by the Romans from the Clyde to the Forth. Now, in truth, this frontier was never very secure, which is why not long after building the wall, the Romans fell back to the more solid version built by Hadrian. When the Romans arrived in what they called Britannia, this whole island was a patchwork of British tribes. In the intervallate region between these 2 walls, we had the Votadini, Selgovae, the Novantae and the Damnonii. Now, the Damnonii power base was located on the north side of the Clyde. The place name was a Brythonic word for a rocky place. A bit like this one. In fact, they tell me that this is the oldest continually occupied fortress in Britain. When the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes came across the North Sea, they began to dominate in the east, and the Britons retrenched gradually over time, splitting the Cymru people of the north, west and south. Now, I'm sure that there'll be people in the comment section who will want to debate about whether these Britons were supplanted, displaced or assimilated. What are they like? I just don't have time for that debate in this video. Plus, I'm not actually an historian. You know that, don't you? The point is that as the Western Roman Empire broke down, the province of Britannia also broke down into smaller kingdoms. In the east, headed by Anglo-Saxon warlords, but in the west, the same people who gave Wales the name Cymru gave the more northern area at various stages the names Cumbria, Cumberland, etc. Now, all these names have their root in the more ancient Brythonic word Cumbrogi, which means compatriots. Anyway, at this stage, we stop hearing about those intervallate tribes that I mentioned and more about the single kingdom of Britons of Al Clut. What's now Scotland, in that post-Roman period, saw tribal groups consolidating into 4 kingdoms. Today, we focus on the Britons who stretch from the Lake District to Loch Lomond. Now, of course, Loch Lomond sits on that Highland fault line. The mountains rising suddenly in the north and west were a physical barrier between these Britons and the Scots in Argyll. I've done a video about them. Further east, anyone that drives past Stirling will notice how the rock of Stirling Castle rises out of what was boggy low-lying marshland, providing another physical barrier between the Britons and those consolidating into what we'll know as the Picts. I'll do a video on them later. And of course, the newly arrived Angles were pushing from the southeast. You'll be hearing about them too. The 6th to the 10th century saw varying alliances and conflicts. Angles attacked Britons, Scots attacked Angles, Picts attacked Scots, and towards the end of the period, Vikings came across the North Sea so that they could be in charge. Basically, medieval Scotland was like Game of Thrones without the smart arse midget. I wonder how long that joke will have currency. It seems that the earliest verifiable king of Al Clut was a guy called Ridurch. Riddick? I've no idea how to pronounce it. I'll put the spelling on screen, sort it out yourself. Anyway, he's talked about in Welsh poems and manuscripts and the Dalriadan book describing the life of St Columba. Apparently Columba thought he was a good guy. Ridurch also lived at the same time as St Mungo, the patron saint of Glasgow. In fact, they both died in 614 AD. So at the start of the 7th century, you can see a kingdom that spread south and east beyond today's Scottish border, consolidating its capital around this area with diplomatic links, ecclesiastical links and respect in neighbouring kingdoms. The video that I did relating to the Scots, I mentioned how Aidan McGabran, possibly the most renowned of the kings of Dalriada, had attacked Al Clut and then taken on Aethelfrith and the Angles. This would have been at the time that Riddick was the king here at Al Clut. The Britons seemed under pressure. By the time we got to the 9th century, the Vikings had come, and they'd weakened each of the 4 previously mentioned groups in different ways, but particularly the Picts and the Scots. And in 849 AD, the Britons crossed that boggy marshland at Stirling and sacked a Pictish centre at Dunblane. The Britons may have been on the rise. But 20 years later, in 870, the Britons would be the butt rather than the beneficiaries of the Vikings. A Viking force from Dublin came up the Clyde and blockaded Al Clut before sacking it and taking off 200 ships with booty, slaves and prisoners for ransom across the Irish Sea. The kingdom of Al Clut was over. But a new kingdom of Britons was beginning. I've crossed the river and come slightly further upstream to Govan. Now, I hear you. When you think about early medieval religious centres and sites of government, Govan is not what comes to mind. And yet, here in Govan Old Church, you can come and see an incredible treasure trove of ancient monuments and early medieval sculptures. Or you will be able to once COVID's disappeared and they've finished the building. Now, the churchyard just up here contained oodles of ancient memorials to high status people from about the 9th to the 11th century. They were contained in a heart-shaped graveyard round about the old original church, built at the start of the 6th century. You see, toppling Al Clut didn't mean the end of the Britons, but a change. Moving upriver from Al Clut, the rock of the Clyde, they came and based themselves in the valley of the Clyde. Strathclut. They were now the Strathclyde Britons. They were what the English of their day might have called Cumberland. The Strathclyde Britons would have still shared language and culture with their southern countrymen who became the Welsh. In fact, I've heard these people called the Strathclyde Welsh. But some of the monuments that you'll see displayed inside this church show that of the high status folk being memorialised, some of them were Viking. Kings of Strathclyde have also married royalty of Picts and Scots. The landscape was gradually changing. See that Shakespeare play? It means that you'll all have heard of Scottish kings like Macbeth and Duncan and Malcolm. And it was around that 11th century that the Kingdom of Strathclyde came under the control of Scottish kings, although it was a process rather than an event. 20 years after his invasion of England in 1066, William the Conqueror completed his Domesday Book cataloguing his land, but Carlisle wasn't yet part of it. By the 12th century, when David I of Scotland brought Walter FitzAlan north and gave him lands just south and west of here, he chose a knight from Brittany to control the people who'd been Strathclyde Britons. Little did he know that that family would go on to form the Stuart monarchs. Sometimes we forget the Britons and the role that they had in the development of Scotland. Even the Proclaimers didn't mention them in Scotland's story. Maybe it was difficult to find a rhyme. I don't know. They seem to have disappeared along with their language and culture, don't they? Now, it's not their genetic code disappeared. After all, we're all ultimately Africans, and we've all got a little bit of Neanderthal genetic code in us as well. So when our colonial cousins do their 23andMe tests and stuff like that, they're bound to find remnants of the Strathclyde Britons in there somewhere too. And of course, the culture isn't entirely gone either. Remember, they shared a little culture with what we call the Welsh and the Cornish. And maybe that's why King Arthur's associated with all three places. One of the ancient Welsh manuscripts, Ygododden, I think that's how you pronounce it, came from what we now call Scotland. And I know every Scot doesn't feel British, but the British were part of the people who made Scotland. If you want to understand more about the people who made Scotland, then click the link coming up on screen now. In the meantime, ha mynd o'ch ysgwyn be lama life. Cheerio and drasta.